All right, let's talk about some examples. And please remember, this is a process and a disease that has been untreatable, so that virtually everyone who comes in with cognitive decline of Alzheimer's in the past has gone on. This has been a terminal illness. So here's an example. This is actually a person who came in 2012. She was 67 at that time. Actually, she's now 75 and doing very, very well. She had a 2-year history of progressive cognitive decline, and a pretty typical story. Her mother had passed away with dementia, and her dementia had started at the age of 62. This woman's had started at 65 with somewhat similar symptoms. She was unable to navigate on the freeway. She would find herself driving even in areas that were familiar to her previously, and she'd have no idea where to get on, where to get off, things like that. Couldn't remember what she'd read, and she actually does these wonderful reports for the government, and she was unable to remember what she had read, so she'd have to read to the bottom of the page and then start at the top again and read down, and she was unable to prepare these. So unable to prepare reports for her work. She couldn't even remember 4-digit numbers, so she was really suffering. She actually had a retinal scan that was positive for amyloid, so she was likely to have the same amyloid-associated cognitive decline, i.e. Alzheimer's disease. And she was treated with RECODE, with reversal of cognitive decline protocol, the 1.0 version. And so she actually got much better. It took about 3 months for her to notice dramatic improvements. She actually called me at home on a Saturday and said, "Oh my gosh, I can't believe it. My memory's better than it's been in 20 years. And interestingly, she went off the protocol 4 different times. And one time she was traveling, she forgot some of the things. One time she had a viral illness. And each time it took about 7 to 10 days. So it doesn't take too long. If you stop everything, it's clear that these things are making a difference, because when you stop, in about 7 to 10 days, typically, you begin to notice a decline, which is exactly what happened to her. So she actually came back to see me after a year. We talked on the phone a few times, etc., because she was back on the East Coast, and then she came out a year later, and I asked her, "Do you mind if I film you?" And she said, "As long as you don't use my name." So you'll see here that her face is pixelated, of course, because she is back at work full-time, doing great. In fact, doing better than she was before this had started. And of course, she does not want others to know. This is still a stigma in our society. She doesn't want others to know that she's been treated for Alzheimer's disease. So she talks here a little bit about her story. So tell me a little bit about how things were a year ago.
Well, a year ago, I was having a lot of difficulty. I was very frustrated because my memory was poor. I had issues of being spatially disoriented, particularly when I was driving. I would get off the freeway at the wrong exit or not know where I was getting back on familiar routes. I would reach in my house for a light switch. I'd reach on the wrong wall, even though I'd always had the light switch has always been on the right side. I'd start reaching to the left. I'd call my animals a different name, my pets, and I was really worried about it. I was very stressed about it. So it was a very stressful time.
And how are things at work?
I have a job that requires a lot of mental analysis, a lot of thinking. I do a lot of research. I have to collect data and design the study and then do the analysis and write a report, usually under pressure. And I was finding that I just couldn't complete an assignment. I couldn't think about the analysis. It was just a jumble to me, and I would start procrastinating and putting it off, and the longer I put it off, the more stress I felt. So I was worried that I was not going to be able to continue with my career.
And tell me a little bit about how things are now.
Things are much improved now. My memory is much better. In fact, I would even go so far as to say I don't think that I have a problem with memory now, which is a great surprise to me from where I was a year ago. My thinking, cognitive ability, and ability to do work, ability to do reports, I am back into the stream of things, being productive and being able to do my analysis and writing, which is fantastic.
And how's the driving?
Driving, no problem. I drive at night, I drive in the daytime, I know where to get off, where to get on. I'm on the highway, so I feel like that's a problem. I'm not reaching for the wrong side of the room for the light switch. I'm not calling my pets the wrong name, which I think they're probably grateful for.
And how overall are you feeling?
I feel great. I feel really, really good. I feel energetic. I feel more peaceful and calm about my life, but at the same time very enthusiastic. I've even started writing my book.
Fantastic.
A couple of chapters.
Okay, thank you very much.
So here's a second person. This is a 70-year-old man who actually had a 12-year history, but very mild decline, and he was doing what many people do, which is that they have some years of mild decline and then they kind of fall off a cliff. And that had been shown with his neuropsychological testing, that he was declining slowly and then he declined dramatically, which is why his wife brought him to see me at the end of 2013. So he's now been on this for 7 years and doing very, very well. So he turned out to be ApoE4 positive, so the most common genetic risk factor. If you have 0 copies of ApoE4, if you're a 3-3, for example, your chance during your lifetime, somewhere around 9%, give or take a little. If you have a single copy, which about 75 million Americans have a single copy, and the vast majority don't know it until they begin to get symptoms, your lifetime risk for Alzheimer's, it's about 30% or so. It's around 3 times the risk if you do not have ApoE4. And if you have 2 copies, and that's about 7 million Americans, then your lifetime risk is well over 50%. It's more likely that you will develop Alzheimer's during your lifetime than that you will avoid it if you have 2 copies of ApoE4. So this is why we want to get everybody, find out your status. In the past, people say, we don't want to know because there's nothing to do about it, and that's absolutely wrong. There's a tremendous amount that can be done in prevention, and especially early reversal. So this person happened to have 1 copy. He actually had a PET scan that was very typical for Alzheimer's disease with temporoparietal reduced glucose utilization. And this tends to occur typically about 10 years before a diagnosis of Alzheimer's. So he was clearly well on his way. His neuropsych testing, you could actually see monotonic decline 2003, 2007, and then 2013, he was really doing poorly. Progressive loss, his California Verbal Learning Test, which is a common one that's used looking at patients with cognitive decline, had gone from all the way from the 84th percentile all the way down to the 3rd percentile. He was unable to remember his lock combination, which is what started all this. He was shocked when he couldn't remember how to get into his locker. They ultimately had to cut the lock off his locker. Couldn't remember faces of people he'd been with, which is another common complaint. Couldn't remember his schedule. So he was really struggling at work and he was basically told, give up, you're going to have to go to a nursing home at some point and you should probably be closing everything down. One of the interesting things about this guy was he was one of these people who was able to add columns of numbers in his head very rapidly. So he would meet with his accountants and say, oh yeah, that's about 430,000. And the accountants would say, wow, that's really impressive. He could do it very quickly. He lost that with his Alzheimer's. He got it back with treatment and still to this day is able to do it. So the diagnosis for him was that he was a late stage MCI, early Alzheimer's disease. He was really crossing over into Alzheimer's disease from mild cognitive impairment. He improved about 6 months, which is common. Interestingly, able to recognize his coworkers again, remember his schedule, remember faces, able to add columns of numbers rapidly once again, able to do his job. And interestingly, he had been told by his neuropsychologist, you really should be shutting everything down because you cannot get better from this thing. He actually decided then to open a new office. So he still has his old offices and he's got a new office as well, and he's doing well. Interestingly, his wife called me and said, you're missing the most important thing. And I said, well, what do you mean by that? And she said, well, yeah, he's better. But what happened with him is that he had been accelerating in his decline for about 12 to 18 months before he started treatment. And she said that completely stopped when he started the treatment. He stopped declining and he went along, and then he started improving after a few months. So this is the sort of pattern that we see. People will first stop their decline, then they'll begin to get just tiny suggestions of improvement, and then they'll really start making bigger improvements. So after he was on for about 2 years, we asked him, and this is now in late 2015, we asked him to go back and say, okay, let's check and see where you stand with your neuropsychological quantitative assessment. And he was, as you can imagine, reluctant to do that. He said, look, I'm back at work doing fine. I know I'm doing well. My coworkers know I'm doing well. My family knows I'm doing well. The last thing I want to do is have someone tell me that I'm not doing as well as I think I'm doing. And we've seen this sort of thing again and again, that when people know they're better and their spouses know they're better and their friends know they're better, when you test them, they typically are better. And you can see here the striking improvements. For example, California Verbal Learning Test Part 2, the second test, Part B, he went from 3rd percentile to the 84th percentile. And you can go right down here and see, for example, auditory delayed memory. He went from 13th percentile to the 79th percentile. His reverse digit span had gone from the 24th percentile to the 74th percentile. So really striking improvements in his abilities that mirrored his subjective improvements. So we were very excited to see that. Here's yet another example. This was a 66-year-old man. Family history, both of his parents had died with dementia, probable Alzheimer's disease. Alzheimer's disease is the most common cause of dementia. This person also a single copy of ApoE4. He had an amyloid PET scan that was markedly positive, had an FDG PET that was typical for Alzheimer's disease, already had a hippocampal volume that was down at about the 17th percentile, and already had neuropsych testing that showed significant mild cognitive impairment. So you can see here, if you look at the metabolic drivers, you can see why this person might be at risk. His hs-CRP was 9.9. We'd like to see it at less than 1/10 of that. His homocysteine was up here at 15.1. There's nice work out of the UK published a few years ago showing that anyone, as you start going 7, 8, 9, 10, there's a direct relationship between your risk for cognitive decline and your association with atrophy of your hippocampus and of your cerebral cortex with your homocysteine level. So this person really was more than double the optimal homocysteine. His vitamin D was also low at 21 nanograms per mil. His testosterone was also low, 264. His free T3 also low at 2.4. His TSH, suboptimal, a little bit higher than we'd like to see it at 2.21. And he responded absolutely beautifully, metabolically, cognitively, volumetrically to this approach with the protocol. And his neurologist actually called and said to me, yeah, he's really back to normal. He's doing very, very well. And if you look here, this person's hippocampal volume went from the 17th percentile to the 75th percentile. So really striking. And interestingly, the neuroradiologist initially didn't believe this. We had to get the films and take them to another group for evaluation. And computational evaluation, whether you look at NeuroQuant, whether you look at NeuroReader, they both showed that there was an improvement in his hippocampal volume, which we've now seen with other patients as well. So striking improvements with this person who continues several years into the protocol to do very, very well. And you can see this went along with his metabolic improvements. As the metabolism goes, so goes the cognition. And his fasting insulin decreased from 32 down to 8. It's not perfect. We'd like to see it down 5, 4 in there, but still dramatic improvement. His hs-CRP went from 9.9 down to 3. Again, we'd like to see it well below 1.0, but it was clearly better. His homocysteine went from 15 down to 8. Again, a marked improvement, and his vitamin D went from 21 to 40. He went from struggling at his work to working full-time and doing very, very well. You can see here improvement, the same person, improvement in his gray matter by 23%. Here is Marcy, another person, a 74-year-old woman who has done very well. You can see here cognitive changes, dramatic improvements, also hippocampal volume improvements with her as well. And this is a person who had a combination of trophic loss, hormonal decrease, but also ended up having exposure to Borrelia and Bartonella, and who did very well. So here we published a number of papers. We published a paper initially on the first 10 patients. That was in 2014. These were mostly subjective improvements because we didn't have a lot of objective follow-up data. Therefore, we followed this up in 2016 with a second paper, which looked at specific objective criteria for these people so that we could quantitate their improvement. That was just another 10 patients, and there was one overlap, so that was a total of 19 at that point. And then in 2018, we published with 15 other groups, a total of 100 patients who all had objective improvement, and that was documented. In some cases, that was with cognitive assessments. They actually all had cognitive assessments, but then some of them also had MRI volumetrics that showed improvement, just as I just showed you, for example, with Marcy. And then some of them also had quantitative EEG improvements. Some also had evoked response, such as P300B improvements. So all of these people had documented improvements in their cognitive state and in their brain function. And here's actually, we've had hundreds of different emails from patients and from physicians. And here's one from a physician who had trained in the protocol and so just wanted to share that my Alzheimer patient had his follow-up visit today, is amazingly better. His family is thrilled with the change in focus, ability to carry on a conversation. Just want to share to thank you. So this sort of thing is happening again and again. And that doesn't mean for a minute that every single person responds. That's not the case. But what we're finding is as we look at the critical pieces and as we're understanding better and better, and as we're getting people earlier, we get more and more positive responses. This is actually from a pastor who says, I have my wife back, my children and grandchildren have their mother and grandmother back. If you would have told me in October of last year that she would be driving a car, singing in the choir, cooking dinner, going into Walmart, teaching Bible study, I would never have believed that could happen, but it did. All right, the next then we're going to be going into the comparison of the 20th century standard of care with the 21st century standard of care, the new approach.